Welcome to The Digital Patient, where we discuss the latest advancements in digital patient engagement and share stories from the front lines. I'm your host, Alan Sardana, and with me as always is CMIO CEO, Dr. Joshua Lieu. Today, we're joined by our very special guest, Dr. Becket Mahnke. Dr. Becket Mahnke is currently the Chief Medical Information Officer at Confluence Health in Wenatchee, Washington. Dr. Mahnke was in the Army for 24 years as a pediatric cardiologist and informaticist until his military retirement as colonel in 2016. He has since had the pleasure of serving as Chief Medical Information Officer for the Queen's and Multicare Health System prior to joining Confluence. During his time with the Army, Dr. Mahnke developed two leading-edge telemedicine platforms. First, the Pacific Asynchronous Telehealth, or PATH, and second, the Asynchronous Local/Overseas Hospital Academic System, or ALOHA. In 2014, Dr. Mahnke received the General Maxwell R. Thurman Award for Excellence in Telemedicine and Advanced Medical Technology for these contributions and others to digital healthcare innovation. He also had two overseas deployments, once in Iraq in 2009 and Afghanistan in 2012. In 2016, Dr. Mahnke joined the Queen's Medical Center as the Chief Medical Information Officer, where he led myriad innovations on the Epic EHR to optimize workflow efficiency and reduce significant costs for the system. After 3 years with the Queen's and 16 years in Hawaii, Dr. Mahnke returned home to Washington, where he joined Multicare Health System as their Chief Medical Information Officer and was responsible for a complete EHR governance overhaul leading into the pandemic, at which point Dr. Mahnke became the medical branch leader for COVID-19 System Incident Command. Dr. Mahnke received his medical degree from the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences in Maryland, did his residency with the Madigan Army Medical Center, and fellowship with the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh. He's board certified in pediatric cardiology and clinical informatics. Dr. Mahnke, Becket, welcome to the show.
Thanks, guys. Nice to be with you. And after hearing all that, I feel very old.
Well, it's certainly an incredible bio. You know, Becket, you've led an absolutely, what I think is adventurous career over the past 2.5 decades. You started your journey, like I said in the bio, as a pediatric cardiologist in Washington. You actually had a brief stint in Korea at the 121st General Hospital as well before doing your fellowship at UPMC. I think at that point you decided you were not done traveling and you were stationed in Hawaii for 16 years, where you led pediatric cardiology and eventually became the Chief Medical Information Officer at the Queen's before completing your trip around the world, returning back to Washington as a CMIO at Multicare, where you led a number of successful digital initiatives before moving a final time to Confluence Health, where you are today as the, again, Chief Medical Information Officer. So from the bio and from what I've just stated, there's so much to unpack with your story. And so to kick off the discussion, coming from the clinical world as a pediatric cardiologist, how did you get involved in digital health and health IT?
So it was really, I would say by accident. I would have had no idea 15 years ago that I would end up where I'm at now. And I probably would have said you're crazy if you would have told me that this is the path I would have taken. I was incredibly fortunate. I finished my residency in Pittsburgh. I was ordered to go to Hawaii, which was really tough duty, obviously. There was an opening, and besides being in Hawaii, which is a wonderful place, I was blessed to work for my former department chief, who was a pediatric pulmonologist, but more important, he was really an early telemedicine innovator. And I remember I'd been there probably a week or two, and I'm still, putting on the big boy pants and wearing the attending, responsibilities. And he pulled me into his office and he handed me a piece of paper. And he said, 10% of your time is going to be doing research projects. Here's the research grant you're going to apply for. I fully expect you to get it and go forth and write this grant. It's due next week. And I'm like, oh, all right. Thank you very much. And it was really, like I said, I would have not guessed it. That turned into, I think, 7 or 8 consecutive years of grant funding for various telemedicine projects, really in the telecardiology space. And it was really just about solving problems that came up. And one of the problems that I think is, it was amazing. The military's kind of centralized care model for their medical centers. I was in Hawaii, and half of the pediatric population I was responsible for lived in Guam, Korea, or Japan. So, and some of those places didn't have pediatric cardiologists available, and they have families stationed there. Even if they did, sometimes there were cultural issues that made that rather challenging for what the expectations were of our families. So I remember very distinctly, I was seeing about a 5 or 6 year old boy. He was in my office, and the family looked just run down because they'd just flown from Misawa, Japan, which is way up in the north, through Tokyo, all the way to Honolulu. I've done that flight several times. It's painful. And listening with my stethoscope, it took me about 30 seconds to tell this family that they were normal. And for, a couple of days of travel each direction for 30 seconds, the real question was, how can we replicate this? Some families weren't happy. They wanted a free, a couple of days in Hawaii, but it still made sense to do it that way, to, obviously save some costs, save some time, but also triage patients quickly and appropriately. Because the converse is sometimes, the device we ended up developing through multiple iterations allowed me to be sitting in my office in Hawaii and literally listening to kids remotely in an asynchronous fashion, because synchronous telemedicine is challenging when you're in the same time zone to get two people in the same time talking together. So we did this asynchronously because we had 5 time zones. We crossed the international date line. It was really challenging. But it's something as simple as, let me capture digital heart sound recording on a patient and listen to it. To get it working well, I think probably took us about 4 years and several iterations.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like there was a real need for this back then. So you had this problem that you had to solve. And so that kind of was, I guess, the impetus for having to implement telemedicine at a time where it wasn't really that prevalent in the world. I was wondering, within the organization, were you the only ones doing telemedicine, or was it that there were other groups, either in pediatrics or in adult care, that were doing it? What was it looking like back then? And was it 2005, I guess, when you first did that, or 2004 maybe?
Well, I started in 2003 and came into the predecessor to PATH, which had a more Hawaiian name called Gecko, and geckos are very common animals in Hawaii. And Gecko was the global electronic children's hospital, but also started by my mentor in 1999, actually. Wow. Going back even further. And at that time, I was stationed in Korea, and I was working with him, but on the receiving end. And the problem we were trying to solve was, we take relatively young graduates, right? Residency graduates in pediatrics and internal medicine, and put them in small remote places without a whole lot of support. So how can they reach back and get the support that they need during those first 1 to 2 years out of training? So it was very heavy in the provider to provider consultation space, but without a whole lot of ability. We could obviously share images, share lab results, but what we worked on for a couple of years was the addition of auscultation, which we then expanded for lung auscultation for our pulmonary fellows as well. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. No, that's great. I can
tell you, when I was there, we didn't have it up and running when I was in Korea. And you come right out of training, and all of a sudden you're in this remote place, and 5 time zones away. When you need help from a specialist, it was really hard for me to find people's numbers and get a hold of them. None of us had smartphones at the time, so it was a challenge.
Yeah, and because this was back in like 2005, 2003, I think you said. Yep. Yeah, that's wild. I'm curious that, it took 4 years for the technology to finally get up to the place where you could use it. The auscultation, like, what was the challenge? Was it in capturing the recording, or why did it take 4 years? I know it's early days. This was before prevalent telemedicine platforms, but.
So a couple challenges. Some were pediatric related. Some were just hardware related. So our first iteration was a Palm Pilot or Palm Pilot
Yeah.
equivalent for those that are listening that are old enough to remember those, that had a stethoscope head glued to the back and a cable going in.
That's awesome.
That platform, just the form factor of that was a little bit difficult for small children. Like you'd be hitting them in the face with the PDA, which wasn't very nice. And it took a long time in kid time frames, trying to get a kid to sit still for 5 minutes of getting all the different sites was very difficult. So then we went to a multi-channel approach that we showed off, 15 years ago at the American Telemedicine Association. And basically we used these sensors and we put them on the chest so we could collect all of the data in 20 seconds.
Wow.
Because they were synchronously recorded. When we were at the ATA, we had a demo and everybody thought it was an EKG. So imagine like what looked like EKG leads, but they were sound capture leads, which one allowed for much quicker data capture. But then I was working with a company that was looking at automated analysis of the sound. So take me out of the picture, right? Say, yep, this is normal, this is abnormal. And the fact that the sounds were all automatically aligned because they were aligned at the same or recorded at the same time allowed for a much higher sensitivity analysis to try to identify normal versus abnormal sounds. But what I think you guys probably have had similar experiences. What I realized during that was there's really 4 pieces and we had to get all 4 pieces right. There had to be a capture piece, and we were capturing sound, but you can't capture any sort of data or information. There had to be a transfer piece, right? How does that actually transfer? I would say Bluetooth and other communications are a little bit easier today. There had to be a playback piece, so people could interpret the sounds. And the first study that we did and published, I had several cardiologists looking through sound files. And then we repeated the study, and instead we had just put the sound files on a graphical representation of the chest. And what happened was you saw people moving the mouse on this GUI the same way that they moved the stethoscope on the patient's chest. And our accuracy went up, right? Because you weren't having to think, wait a minute, what file am I listening to now? What's this weird naming convention? And so going from a file folder analysis to a natural GUI that we're all used to. And then finally, so there's capture, transfer, playback or viewing, and then the last piece was reporting. And we didn't really get much adoption until we nailed all 4 of those pieces.
Wow. That's incredible. I'm curious, from your clinical background, how does your personal journey with the Army and being a clinician impact your views on patient-centered care as it relates to digital technology, but then also just interacting with patients throughout their health experience?
So I think I'm glad I had my early career in the Army. What I'm going to say may sound a little bit corny, but I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, why on earth would there be a pediatric cardiologist in the military, right? I'm not supporting the warfighter, although I would argue that we do. So, having deployed before, I understand what it's like to be downrange, and the role of the pediatric caregivers is to ensure that the folks that are doing some really difficult, stressful jobs don't have to worry about what's happening at home, right? I mean, if I put a young soldier on a plane to a combat zone, it was very important for us to say, listen, don't worry about home, we got you covered. And that can cover financial things and housing and all the support mechanisms, but that includes their healthcare. So I think that made it much more personal. Obviously, the quality has to be there, right? So you have to provide quality care, but I think you have to have the added benefit of a patient experience, digital or not digital, that is supporting the family members that are not deployed, and the family members that are. And I mean, I've had conferences with families where the patient and the family was sitting in my office, and through some telemedicine device, we had usually the dad who would be stationed in Iraq or Afghanistan, and having the ability to have those conferences is very, very important. So I think those helped shape kind of some of my approaches. Obviously, we were essentially a single payer system. So I was incentivized to keep patients where they were, like when they were in Guam or Korea, because my health system, right, was footing the bill for them to fly over to see me and putting them up with lodging, but also trying to, both parents usually came on those trips for good reason, but now I've taken a soldier or sailor out of their primary job, so the readiness goes down as well.
Becket, having served yourself, did that change, I guess, your approach to conversations with the family?
It helped. And I didn't appreciate this as much until after I retired and took off the uniform. There is an automatic level of alignment when you walk into a room and you're wearing the same clothing as somebody else. Maybe I see you two almost have the same uniform on today. That may be the seamless uniform.
At our company, everyone has to wear a uniform.
But, so that was a factor. And just having an understanding, these were some, unusual situations, right, where folks are. And even the setting, take deployment out of it, right? So I'm in Hawaii. You can imagine there's a very young family with a new child with a disease, and they're stationed in Hawaii. They may be from the East Coast, right? So that it's a very unnatural environment because we put these young families all over the place. And I remember training pediatric residents that would come in, and I used to see general pediatric clinic as well. Once half a day a week was the requirement. And the young resident would come in and they'd say, I can't believe they're coming in for this silly problem. Like, why are they wasting my time? And I would explain to the resident that they were acting as the grandparent, right? Because in normal society, the grandparents provide advice to the parents for a lot of those low-end things. Mm-hmm. We have ripped the grandparents away. Nowadays, it might actually be a little bit better because, you can always get grandma and grandpa with FaceTime, right? But it was that unnatural situation. So it helped deliver that care in that fashion.
Yeah. When you eventually, I guess, moved to, Queens Medical Center and be, over CMIO, was it in your plans at the time to become a CMIO? Was that accidental given all the tech experience you developed over the years? How did that happen?
Again, accidental. So I will go back to 2014. I need to make sure this becomes, stays PG. But around 2014, my colleague, who is a pediatric endocrinologist, we'd done several projects together around pediatric diabetes and telemedicine. And he came to me with a journal and he flipped it open to the page and he said, look, there's now a clinical informatics board certification option. And we can submit the work that we've done as constructive credit, not do the 2-year fellowship, because we've basically been doing this, and sit for the boards. And I am a little embarrassed to admit that our primary motivation at the time was, let's say, to get some credibility with the folks, the pure IT folks, that when we came up with projects, they would kind of look at us and pat us on the head and say, oh, that's really cute. You doctors go back and take care of patients. And so we did it. And through the process, the application process and studying for the boards, we realized we've been doing informatics for 10 years. We had no idea that that's what we were doing. So got board certified, totally changed the relationship with IT, bring some credibility. And then when I retired in 2016, the opportunity came up at the Queen's Health System, and At the time, I was about half clinical and half doing informatics work, both on the EHR and in telemedicine. And I said, you know what, I've got an opportunity. Why don't I see if I want to really flex that clinical informatics skill set? And so I decided to join Queens. I was very lucky to be there. I was 80% informatics and 20% clinical. So I kept a little bit of clinical work there, but and obviously I've enjoyed doing that role. You know, throughout my career, I told you I started at 10%. It slowly crept up to 50%, and now it's 80% of the work that I do.
Is it the normal mix for as a CMIO that it's 80-20 informatics versus clinical, or does it vary depending on the organization and your preference?
One, I think there are some people that are zero clinical, and I think that's a mistake. I don't think you can be effective as a leader or as a technologist and informaticist. I think that most people find, even if they're, let's say, 50-50, they quickly learn that there is more, they need more time unless they're in a very small organization. And that's really as that role has progressed. You know, I think everybody thought, oh, you'll need a CMIO, we'll implement the EHR, and then you can go back to being a clinician again. And I think that's far from the case as that role continues to grow.
Mm-hmm. And I know, Becket, you're participating in a webinar in a month from now on CMIOs and understanding the role, but what are 2 to 3 traits you would attribute to being a successful CMIO? So
I'm going to be a pain in the butt and answer a different question first.
Okay.
And that's what is the skill you don't need, right? Because I was looking through these questions yesterday and I said, I realized I'll give you my answer in a minute, but the one that is absolutely not necessary is technology skills, right? I mean, it's funny. I'm looking for some new physicians to join our team, and I keep getting these people that are like, I really like tech. I'm like, I don't care. You know, the skills that I need you to have, and I don't know if this is 1 or 2, but it's really communication skills, the ability to understand what somebody is saying or extract what they really mean and what they're really trying to do, and then translate that from the clinical side to the IT side. And some days I pinch myself. I'm like, I can't believe all I'm doing is going from one group to another and explaining and serving as a translator. I think it is not really any difference. I was in graduate medical education programs for 20 years. And I think that same skill set for training medical students and residents, it's really about communicating, right? Is how do you explain a problem, come up with a formulated way of solving that problem. And so I think that is just translated over really well. So communication skills, interpreting skills, and the ability to say no or not right now. I have been accused by some of my colleagues sometimes when they get frustrated with me that I'm the CMI no, the CMIO. But this, I think you guys know this all too well. We are in an extremely target-rich environment, right? And it is so easy to get distracted. And each problem that may seem simple on the surface takes a lot more time. So really, really focusing and setting some goals that are some longer term goals. Otherwise, I can just sit on email all day long, but I don't actually accomplish much at the end of the year.
I know, Becket, you said that being good at tech or liking tech a lot is not the most important thing as a CMIO. Have you found that having a, I don't know, baseline authentic enthusiasm for tech to be important to, want to become a CMIO and be happy at it? Or do you find that people end up being a CMIO, really didn't care about tech in the first place, fell into it like you did, and then, I guess this is what I'm doing now. I'm just wondering how much that baseline interest does matter, at least to make folks get into it and be happy there.
I think the baseline interest isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think that we may have selected at times for people that are not, that are they might have the tech skills, but they lack that communication skill. And that is really hard to lead change. During the conversion from paper to an EHR, maybe that was useful, but I think that's CMIO 1.0. And now it's really about change management and adoption, and workflows are much, much more important.
Could I kind of maybe say some folks who are very tech savvy wanted to become a CMIO because they wanted to become a chief medical innovation officer. And then when they realized that being a CMIO was more about, like you said, change management, communication, workflows, and not just about, using the latest tech all the time.
Right.
That actually makes a lot of sense.
I mean, I loved being at Queens. Queens has, I don't know this for certain, but I'll bet you Queens has one of the largest age ranges of physicians. I mean, I had obviously physicians in their 20s during their residency, but I had probably more than a dozen physicians still practicing full-time in their 80s.
Wow.
Right. So to develop technology and deploy technology across a user base of 5 or 6 decades takes a lot more change management techniques than just the pure technology. And you can get lost in the technology, and those folks have a role. I'm not sure it's a CMIO role. I think it's an innovation role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, you're to hear first. So we're gonna create this new role called the Chief Medical Innovation Officer. They already did that to the CIO role, right? You now have Chief Innovation Officer. So,
Right.
it could be a thing.
Well, and people get, we had this conversation in my prior organization, the difference between innovation and invention, right? Invention's truly tough. Innovation is really just grabbing existing pieces and putting them together in a way that solves the problem. I refer to myself often as the Chief Medical Imitation Officer. So I don't want to create anything, right? Let somebody else wade into a new problem, have the failures that are inevitable and part of the process, and then I'm going to try to learn from them and copy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes, here we joke around, but not really totally joke, where R&D stands for research and development, but could also stand for rip and deploy.
Right. Absolutely. So it's fun to create, and I've been guilty of trying to invent something new, but there are a lot more similarities in medicine, and if we look at it as deploying a commodity from an equity standpoint, I think it's more important to deploy proven methods than to try to innovate all the time.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. So actually, Becket, kind of speaking on the CMIO role 1.0, when we were going from paper to EHR, we're now at a point where health systems have successfully implemented their EHRs, and now are undergoing a digital transformation more towards consumer patient experience. And how do we really bring patients into our digital ecosystem? I'm curious to know your thoughts on how the role of the CMIO will evolve over the next 5 to 10 years.
I'm more excited than ever, right? I think that we have clearly made a transition. I think we've made the transition from paper to computer. We've not really gone from analog to digital in a lot of our work, and that's okay. Not to belittle the work that has been done, which is a massive amount of work. And even the crankiest providers that I work with, if you press them, say, do you want to go back to paper? They're like, oh God, no, we don't want to go back there. So we recognize that this has been a big improvement. Can I share something with you guys?
Yeah,
please.
So I will share, and this is something that is in development for a webinar I'm giving with a colleague next month. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
So, and I won't go through all of this, but and to be totally fair, some of this is blatantly stolen from my CMIO colleagues. There was a great article published. Where was it published? Healthcare Innovation Group published something recently, and a lot of well-known CMIOs weighed in. And I initially was going to give this talk CMIO 1.0 to 2.0, realized that a lot of my colleagues are already talking about CMIO 3.0. So apparently I'm behind the game as well. But you can see the early days were implementation, meaningful use, things that were important, but maybe not the most sexy, and ultimately didn't get the most bang for the buck. CMIO 2.0, there's been some incredible work around EHR optimization, clinical decision support optimization. And I'll call out, specifically patient engagement. I think that's probably where patient engagement started. Technically, it probably started in 1.0. But I think most organizations are in the phase where you've got your EHR stabilized, it's relatively optimized. You've got the basics of a patient engagement portal, but now how can we really leverage the patient to become part of the care team and bring in the technologies that we're all carrying around in our pockets, right? We carry around the most incredible sensors that I wish I had in the early days of teleauscultation, to be honest. But how do we bring that in? And I think it's not only bringing the patient in, but changing the care model to some degree. Obviously, payment and reimbursement has to be aligned, but really transitioning from that more acute model to the chronic model, right? I mean, where's the disease burden today? It's chronic disease. Leads to acute flare-ups, but there are chronic disease issues. And I think we are lying to ourselves if we think that we can go be successful in chronic disease management at a population level without, number one, engaging the patient, and number two, having frequent touch points, not a once a year or once every 6 months type of visit. So I think the infrastructure is there. I think we're now seeing a host of different approaches to getting the patient engaged. I'm a little concerned that not only does the healthcare system, where most of us were educated more of an acute disease model. So that's a challenge to transition to chronic disease management, but also for the patients, right? We know from published studies that it is difficult to engage patients, right? Once you get them engaged, you can really have some improved outcomes. But honestly, if one of my gastroenterology colleagues was working on our colorectal cancer screening rates and using relatively simple, nudges to try to get patients to have their colorectal cancer screening. She was disappointed that she had a response rate of only 20%. Mm-hmm. Well, that's actually a pretty darn good one if you look at the published literature. So I reassured her that she was doing a great job, but are we really going to move the needle on pop health if we can only get 20% of our patients truly engaged? So I'm looking to folks like you guys to partner with us in that journey and make it meaningful and hopefully measurable to the patients to really engage as part of that process.
Yeah, but on that note, I guess, you're seeing it, there's this explosion of, patient-facing innovations in digital health, and there's so many different, ways to go about it or use cases and so forth. I guess, broadly speaking, what innovations in the patient-facing side of things are exciting you most lately?
So you're exactly right. And I'm working with some of my colleagues right now as we're trying to kind of formalize a patient engagement strategy. And when I read some of the reviews put out there by KLAS, who I love as a health IT kind of research organization, I've read, I think, 2 or 3 of them recently, and I'm still debating about sharing them with my colleagues. because they can't quite put the market into a framework, right? There's all these different use cases that all do slightly different things, and trying to develop a model. One, my brain needs a model. I think I'm like, okay, how am I going to approach this? So provide me a model. But more importantly, in the absence of a clear model, and I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing class, because it's a tough segment right now. In the absence of a model, I think it might sound good, but when it comes where the rubber meets the road and you try to deploy this and get adoption, the health system is not likely set up to take that on. Who's the owner? Who pays for it? Who benefits from it? So I think that's where structure may actually help with implementation and adoption. Because, you know, I've been in meetings where executive teams decide to move forward with something, and then it gets down to the people that are actually going to do the work, those wonderful people. And it's like, okay, well, this actually doesn't fit into our current organizational structure. So those are some challenges. I will tell you, I think the most exciting part, well, one is just the amount of different innovations that are going forth. But I think the exciting part is the fact that the larger platforms are opening up app stores, right? That it seems like a new model, although it's really not that different than what they've done before. So I met with a vendor partner the other day, and they said, what do you want your providers and patients to think of us? And my response was, I don't want them to know you exist, right? I want them to use their existing tools, and we're an Epic shop, right? So Epic, if you're the Hyperspace, if you're the healthcare provider, MyChart, if you're the patient, right? And I want your technology integrated into that framework so the patient or provider doesn't know any better. And sometimes people look at me, they're like, well, that's crazy talk. But we've been doing it for years with our pharmacy data, right? All the pharmacy data that's in the EHRs is provided usually by one of two vendors, right? The EHR vendors don't provide that. Same thing with terminology. IMO provides those terminologies. So the ability to plug those into a familiar space and have a single unified approach is key. And, you know, several years ago, we had my boss was telling me about this great app for post-hip replacement surgery. And we were going to do this, and it was the greatest thing ever. And it was a slick app. But I said, okay, let me give you a use case here, right? So Mrs. Jones gets her hip surgery, she goes home. Now she has to have MyChart and App X on her phone, right? And she goes into App X to look at her hip replacement. And then she has a question for her provider. So what does she do? She has to log into MyChart and send information to a provider who doesn't have access to that platform. Or if they do, then they have to go log into another portal. And that's when we decided we're not going to pursue that strategy. So that integration is I think key.
Yeah, I love the idea that the best technology experiences are the ones where you don't even know the technology is there even. It just fits right into the existing workflow or user experience. That makes a ton of sense. And actually, your story reminds me of, oh my gosh, I just I just blanked out while I was complimenting your story. I'll get back to it if it comes up again.
I'll tell you one that you just reminded me of. So Dr. Larry Weed, who invented the soap note, I heard him speak years ago, and he talked about, you know, technology being invisible and also really not having to think about how it works. And he said, 2 pieces of technology that you use every day and you don't know how they work: the telephone and the toilet. He's like, you just use it and you go on your way. So I want all of my providers and patients' internal CPU power focused on the problem and issue at hand, not on the pieces of technology that are supporting them.
I remember now, Becket, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was when you had that great slide up on the transition to CMIO, 3.0, there were a lot of priorities at in this current stage of evolution of the role. You had stewardship, you had patient engagement 2.0, we had all kinds of things. And so when you think about prioritizing all of these opportunities as a CMIO, are you working on all at the same time? Are you stack ranking? Like, how does that actually work in a complex health system?
That is one of the most challenging parts of my job. And I tell my leaders, to be honest, I don't want to be in the prioritization game. Actually, let me rephrase that. I'm happy to prioritize. You don't want me in the prioritization game. I'm happy to help structure it. I'm happy to help visualize the work that is being done and planned so that our senior leaders can ensure that we have a balanced approach, right? It can't be all quality or all finance or all pop health. And I've done that for years using roadmaps to the point, I don't have one handy, but in Hawaii, when we had our analytics program, we had an analytics resource, right? Our enterprise data warehouse, our analysts, and they had a certain amount of resource that we could spend on analytics, and everybody wanted a piece of them. And every month we put up a roadmap, and it was color coded by finance, quality department, pop health, ambulatory. And if that roadmap had too much of one color on it, trust me, the other three colors were going to start to chime in. So I think displaying what you're doing, making sure that all the different parties within an organization that have interests understand what the other interests are as well. And you know what? People are incredibly reasonable. People are naturally going to argue for what's in their silo, right? But once they see other silos, they're like, oh, well, yeah, this is one piece of our larger organization. So I focus a lot with my IT colleagues in presenting that work so that we all understand what is being worked on. And then to try to create a space for the informaticists, the IT specialists, and frankly, the operational partners that we need to work with us on projects, give them a space to do that is not constantly, well, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this. So that's where I got into saying no. I'm like, you know what? We're going to put this in our pile of ideas over here that we're going to ignore, because right now, here's our roadmap of really key things. And sometimes one of those ideas has to be done, right? And that's totally understandable. But then the question becomes, okay, which one of these other items are we going to stop doing so that we can do this right? And again, the focus on, I know it's a little corny, but on time and on budget, but delivering a quality product as well. Wrapping up that project, and I've instituted a rule at every place I've been that once something goes live, you don't get to change it for 6 months. Right now, if it's broken or there's a safety issue, obviously that trumps it. But what that does is it ensures that people clearly define what they want. They clearly do good testing before it goes live. But once it goes live, we're in the adoption phase, and you don't get to adapt it for 6 months. You need to work on the change management that goes along with adoption.
Yeah, I really like that. I think it definitely points back to your earlier point around communication and how important that is. And so maybe it's a visual form of communicating, but it's really ensuring everybody's on the same page. One thing that is also in line with communication, this is a story from back when you were at the Queen's Medical Center, but you were the executive leader for a number of different initiatives, like the Refuel Project, and this one that I read about, the Epic Smart Ribbon, which helped the health system reduce costs and time spent in the EHR, a number of opioids prescribed, things like that. I think I read the original plan for this initiative was to introduce predictive analytics that would appear on the EHR screen at the point of care. But apparently the original plan changed when you put it out for adoption. So I was wondering if you could share that story, because I think that speaks to communication as well.
So my first week at the Queen's Health System, my boss came to me, I think it was the Friday of my first week, and he dropped a contract on my desk and he said, we just signed this, so you need to implement this. I said, okay, this will be fun. And we partnered with a predictive analytics company around predicting remaining length of stay for inpatients and readmission risk with targeted ways to modify that in the right direction. So that was goal number one. Importantly, we said, if this data lives outside of workflow, it will never be successful. So we partnered with Illumicare, who had a ribbon that sat on top of the EHR to basically say, let's take third-party analytics and stick them in workflow. We could have put it into Epic, and we probably still would be working on that piece right now, right? Because that's a hard thing to do. And what happened was the predictive analytics were, let's say, not that predictive, or they didn't offer actionable insights. But what happened was, as part of that ribbon, we were showing the native ribbon provides information on the costs of medications and lab tests, right? Not charges, but costs. And for a hospital that gets paid on a DRG adjusted basis, you're going to get this much money to take care of a patient with heart failure. So spend it wisely, right? And it was amazing because not only would it show the cost, but it would show when there was a high quality alternative that was of lower cost. And providers have no idea what things cost, right? I'm going to tell you a story that I found on YouTube, right? Because the story is, I don't watch the TV show Ellen, okay? But there was an episode of Ellen where Bill Gates from Microsoft was on, and they were playing a game, and they had 5 items from the grocery store, and he had to guess what the prices were. And guess what? Bill Gates has no idea what things cost, right? And everybody in the audience was laughing at him because he had no idea what dishwasher detergent costs, right? I would argue that providers also have no idea what medications cost. And you can go to guidelines that say for disease X, the best treatment is treatment A or treatment B. Those might be a 10x difference in cost. And we don't know, we just don't talk about it. So what we did was we just put the costs in front of our inpatients. And what happened was our cost per admission decreased by $110 per admission. And that was money back to the healthcare system because we were using lower cost medications, repeating less labs as well. And it wasn't a forcing function. It was just providing information to smart folks, and they made good decisions. The other really interesting piece there was my colleagues would say, when I talked to them, the hospitalists would say, you know what, when I saw that you recommended that Miss Jones go from Med A to Med B, I never, ever changed it from Med A to Med B. And I'd say, that's okay. And they'd look at me like, wait, you wanted me to change it? I said, but when you admitted your next patient, Miss Smith, you didn't use drug A, you used drug B. And he's like, yep. And I said, we changed behavior then, okay? So in that space, it was more about changing long-term behavior than a particular action. Sorry, Josh.
No worries. I had a follow-up on that. So those providers who, I guess, maybe changed behavior based on those pop-ups that came up, did they have any incentive to do so? I'm going to guess their payment wasn't affected by being more cost-effective or anything. It just...
Nope.
So it was around, I guess, the shared values of just wanting to deliver more cost-effective quality care,
Right. And we would provide benchmark reports, who would reduce cost the most, who was having the fewest violations of, using more expensive meds. But I think, almost every healthcare system that I know has some form of stewardship mentioned in their mission, vision, or values. The challenge is we don't often provide our clinicians information on how to be better stewards, other than don't admit a patient, but that's hard to do. So it was fascinating to just show people information and see how the behavior changed.
I think that's such an incredible point about if you want to promote a change, you have to make it as frictionless as possible to, make it easy to do the right thing. Otherwise, you're just hoping for too much. I mean, you're right. These are busy providers. They have a million things going on day to day with patient care. If you add another layer of friction, like good luck, seeing a difference, it's just not possible. That makes a lot of sense.
You sound like my old mentor. So when we were developing our telemedicine platform, the goal was, so when I was in Korea, I could either fill out the 3899, which was the form number to send a patient to Hawaii, or I could use this teleconsultation platform. And I remember he picked up the 3899 one day. He goes, "You got to be faster than this." And he's like, if they can fill this out faster, and it's not that they're not great people. They want to finish their day and go home and spend time with their family, right? So, how can you make that frictionless?
So what you did was you made the form 10 times as long, and then everyone did the teleconsultation.
Well, there was a period where I will say that program lost clinical control, meaning it was taken over by IT, and they redesigned the process that became so painful that we saw a drop off, right? And then, early on we rebuilt it, which was basically rip out all these other things. Like they would ask for mandatory input of information that we already knew, right? So got to make it easy.
Yeah. Last question that I had, Becket. So you've talked throughout this conversation about your approach to 6 months, no adapting the technology. Let's just focus on adoption and take it from there unless there's a safety issue or things like that. Implementing any type of innovation definitely involves risk. And so I was curious, what are your thoughts, or how do you view the relationship between failure and innovation?
I mean, they go hand in hand. You're not going to have real innovation without failure, right? And failure is just a form of feedback. It's the opposite of a positive experience, but you look towards that. I was, again, very lucky to work for a boss who was very tolerant of that. The early years in telemedicine were actually very tolerant of that as well. There was a meeting scheduled. This is probably 2006-ish, and it was the only presentations they would accept were telemedicine failures, right? Things that never get published because they're failures. And he said, "You know what? We have so much to learn from that space." So he's like, "We're only going to do public, talk about things that failed." But no, it's part of the process. Now, I think the converse, though, can be an overuse of pilots, right? So my colleagues know that I hate it when they're like, "We're going to do a pilot," because it's often not a pilot. It's usually a phase one. Or if it's truly a pilot, there's no real criteria on what success or failure is going to be. Or they're trying to reproduce published literature, right? And I don't think that that's necessarily the role if you're going to adopt. So the pilot is rarely much cheaper than a full rollout. The technology integration, that's the challenge, right? You guys know in the digital space, building the first one is really hard. After that, it's almost free, right? Because you can replicate that. So I'm much more of a fan of saying, listen, if we're going to go in a direction, yes, there's going to be some failures along the way, but we've seen other organizations that have succeeded in this area. We don't need to prove it beyond a p less than 0.05 that there's a benefit. Let's trust our literature and let's focus our efforts on really understanding our workflows and adopting and supporting our people. Because I see this all the time, and I think this is kind of where governance is going as well, is for any initiative, I have this much amount of time that I can spend. And historically, we spend this much time on talking about it in the pilot. And then the rollout, we're just all tired and we're moving on to something else. So, if we can adopt versus invent from scratch, I think we're much better off and get successful outcomes.
Right. Yeah, totally agree with that. I know Josh talks about that all the time. So I think we're all on the same page there. I lied. I do have one last question. We'll jump over to the fast five really quick, 5 questions, but one off topic question that I had, when I was looking into your entire career, I came across something that was pretty fortuitous in my eyes. During your time in Hawaii, I think you got really into photography and videography, and you've really captured some truly remarkable scenes. One of them, I know you were traveling in the Death Valley sand dunes, and you've produced a piece called Mesquite Magic. It's absolutely stunning. The composition of it, the color contrast, everything is phenomenal. And so my question is really, how did you get into photography, and is this still a passion or hobby of yours?
Definitely a passion. Behind one of the doors behind me is way too much photographic equipment that, I have somewhat justified in that. And I'm actually, in all seriousness, my specialty practice of pediatric cardiology is very image focused with echocardiography. And I've actually learned quite a bit about how to become a better imager in my clinical space based on understanding photographic, technology. That's the way I justify at least some of my choice. I was in it, I was into it in the film age, and really it didn't give me all of the opportunity that I really wanted. And then when I deployed to Iraq in 2008, I think is when I had a lot of downtime, fortunately, in between chaos, but spent a lot of time kind of self-learning digital photography. I remember I did a lot of it in Afghanistan as well. That I did it one day, like literally when a missile came into the building right next to me, came right into the building, and I'll be honest, I didn't hear a thing. I had my headphones on. I was deep into that. But no, it's tremendously rewarding. It allows. I travel quite a bit, some for play, but I do a lot of international pediatric cardiology work. So, my camera and my drone go with me just about everywhere I go.
Wow, that's really cool stuff. All right, Becket, just being mindful of your time, let's flip over to what we call the Fast Five lightning round. 5 questions to get to know you better for our audience. The first question that we have is, what is your favorite book or book you've gifted the most?
So I narrowed it down to 4. How about that? But these are books I've given to my physician informaticist. So number 1, The Digital Doctor, fascinating history of EHRs and how we got here. Really starting in the 80s and 90s, believe it or not. The Design of Everyday Things is a classic for just design of a variety of things, mostly outside of the technology space. Measure What Matters is a way of kind of goal setting, and Never Split the Difference, which is really about negotiation from a hostage negotiator. Fascinating read, but I'm honestly on my 4th read of it right now. Wow. It's that good.
Yeah. That's great. Question 2, favorite travel destination?
I think that's an easy one. I've been to Nepal trekking 4 times. The Himalayas are beautiful, but I've been to the Alps, I've been to the Andes, and it's the people of Nepal which keep me coming back. The mountains are beautiful, but to be able to sit down with local folks and eat a plate of dalbat with your hands is phenomenal.
That's awesome. Question 3, this one's a bit different, but would you rather have super strength, super speed, or the ability to read people's minds?
But more importantly, I approached this, I think, as a physician does, which is, okay, those are the 3 things on the differential. What do you eliminate first? So I don't want to know what people are thinking. So that was an easy one to rule out. And super strength, I think that means a lot of people are going to be asking me to help them move. So I had a truck in college, and it seemed like every weekend I was helping somebody move. So I think I'm going to take super speed.
Nice. I like the thought process there. That's great. Question 4, what is something in healthcare you believe that others might find insane?
I spent a lot of time at Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh in the transplant world, and transplant medicine is wonderful. but it's a strange situation where you're literally using organs from one person and putting them into somebody else. And it's fascinating what we've been able to do, but I bet you in 20 years, we will look back and be like, oh my God, they used to put other people's parts into new people. So once you peel it back the curtain too far, and small bowel transplant's even stranger. So
well, now we're doing animal organ transplants to humans. There's been some.
Yeah, the first heart, the pig heart to human, he just died a couple of days ago.
Oh, wow.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that. Jeez.
But yeah, we'll get there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Last question that we have, Becket. This is a pandemic related question. What is one hobby or activity you've gotten into since the beginning of the pandemic?
So don't judge me, but if I opened up, I think it's that door, you could walk into my bar area, and I think there's
cool.
94 different whiskeys that are on.
Oh,
there.
nice.
So it started at the beginning of the pandemic, probably around 20 different whiskeys, and now it's almost into triple digits.
Do you have a favorite one, or?
Oh, I can't have favorites. There's so many good ones, but no, I very much enjoying it. We're going to Scotland here in a couple months.
Wow.
So we'll be able to tour there as well, but
Amazing.
different ways to produce whiskey, and it's nice. Last night I went and looked at the shelf, and I had a wide range to choose from.
That's glorious. That's awesome. Well, Becket, thank you so much for coming on the show. I feel like we could probably talk to you for another like 4 hours. You have so many stories, so many like, just your career in general, so many insights into the evolving landscape of the CMIO and how it's changed over time. And then also just the, your own personal journey to leading to where you are today. So thank you so much for your time and coming on the show and sharing some of that with us.
Thank you guys. Great talking with you.